Good evening. I'm Mike Stiles, and I serve as the chair of the Committee of 70 Board of Directors. After working as a prosecutor, judge, and U.S. attorney, and then as executive vice president for the Phillies, it's my great honor to serve in this position at 70 at such an important time. I believe that our mission of promoting representative, ethical, and effective government is now more important than ever. Moreover, I believe that the Committee of 70 played an important moderating role during the contentious election of 2020. And I think many of us hoped for calmer, less divisive times thereafter. But it appears that the intensity of this moment in our political history has yet to subside. Our institutions remain under attack. We are seeing a remarkable lack of trust in our elected officials and, frankly, in each other. Progress toward full equality for all of our citizens is slow, and at times seems to go in the wrong direction. But, as often has been said, the price of democracy is eternal vigilance, and that has been the business of the Committee of 70 for over 117 years. We remain committed to the work of ensuring free and fair elections, informing and engaging voters, and holding our elected officials accountable. Looking forward, our years-long effort to educate and engage Pennsylvanians on the redistricting process to ensure fairer electoral maps across the Commonwealth is about to be realized. Every year is an election year, and we'll continue to work to provide the information Pennsylvanians need in order to cast their ballots. We expect that the eyes of the nation will turn again to Pennsylvania in 2022, when we fill our open Senate seat and governor's chair, and in 2024, when Pennsylvania is sure to once more play a critical role in the presidential election. We also will never lose sight of what's happening in our own backyard. We will be prepared to help however we can in our city's effort to elect our 100th mayor in 2023. I'd like to take a moment on behalf of all of us on the board and staff of the Committee of 70 to thank David Thornburg for his extraordinary leadership over the last 7 years. As you probably know, David is leaving his position as president and CEO of 70 for new experiences and responsibilities. He has been a wonderful leader, directly responsible for 70's success and enhanced influence in advocating for good government. He has been our clear voice in telling the truth when it needed to be told in a credible, nonpartisan manner. In answer to the significant challenges I described earlier, David has responded with consistent fairness, intelligence, and resolve. Those challenges did not get him down, they stirred him up. Thank you, David. We look forward to new leadership at 70 to continue this good fight. We know that we have plenty of work remaining, but I have faith in our citizens and in our institutions. I have confidence that with the help of the work of the Committee of 70 and many others, our democracy will endure and thrive. We appreciate all of you for joining us tonight and thank our many generous sponsors and supporters. Your commitment to our work made this night possible. I'd particularly like to thank our presenting corporate sponsor, Brandywine Realty Trust, and our presenting individual sponsor, the Lau Longsworth Charitable Fund, for their special leadership and commitment to our cause. Please enjoy this innovative and groundbreaking program we call Principles, Parties, and Where America Goes From Here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Thornburg, President and CEO of the Committee of 70. It's been my great pleasure to serve as the CEO of the Committee of 70 these last 7 years. I want to welcome you to our office to tell you a little bit about the work we do and the impact it's made. The voting booth is really at the core of all of 70's work. And this is a special voting booth. This is Palm Beach County, Florida, the year 2000. You just might remember it. When you look carefully, you can see the butterfly ballot and how maybe that confused voters. If your eyesight's good and you look carefully, you might see a dimpled Chad or a hanging Chad that illustrates the confusion that voters had. And a reminder that that election came down to 537 votes in one state, which should underscore the sense that every vote counts in every election. When it comes to voting, we're kind of old school. We agree with Thomas Jefferson that the democratic process works best when more people get involved and more people know what they're voting about. That's why we've spent so much time educating and engaging voters through our flagship initiative called We Vote, working with our board members and institutions around the Philadelphia region and in our communities. We've encouraged everyone to take advantage of We Vote's education materials and awareness to understand how they vote, when they vote, and who they're voting for. When it comes to nonpartisan voter education, we try to use every tool in the toolkit. We've done podcasts, we've done Studio C70 Facebook Live interviews with candidates and election officials and poll workers and voters to make sure that the word gets out there. Our trademark newsletter goes to 40,000 people every week, making sure that they're on top of all the news that they need to use to vote, to be aware of elections, and to understand what they're voting about. But we also realize at the Committee of 70 that to build a strong local democracy, we need active citizens who do more than just voting. That's why we launched a few years ago the Campaign for Political Responsibility, recognizing that we need to build habits of effective citizenship. First is, of course, that you be a voter. Second, that you choose your news wisely. Third, that you invite diverse perspectives, a very challenging thing to achieve these days. Fourth, that you learn how it works, learn how the voting process works, learn how government works. And fifth, that you act, that as a citizen, you need to make sure that your voice is heard. Committee of 70 also, probably more than anybody in the Commonwealth, has for years paid attention to what happens on Election Day. And we know that the most challenging job on Election Day is to be a poll worker. That's why we've worked hard to recruit poll workers, working with local election officials, and to improve the quality of materials that they have to understand how they can do their jobs to serve our citizens.
Principles, Parties, and Where America Goes From Here, presented by the Committee of 70. Tonight we hear from Michael Smerconish, Judy Woodruff, Kristen Soltis Anderson, and House Majority Whip James E. Clyburn. Thank you to our committed sponsors for their continued support to make this event possible.
Good evening. I'm Michael Smerconish, your host for this year's edition of 70 Minutes, Principles, Parties, and Where America Goes From Here. This event, which also marks the Committee of 70's 117th year, promises to be informative and stimulating. We're going to hear perspectives from both sides of the aisle on the realignment of the American electorate, the current state of American politics and political parties, and how this all will play out for 2022 and beyond. From our guests, Judy Woodruff, Kristen Soltis Anderson, and a special conversation with House Majority Whip James Clyburn. Let's kick this off with our first segment. We're fortunate to have some thoughts from Judy Woodruff. Judy is the anchor and managing editor of PBS NewsHour. She's an award-winning journalist with a career spanning more than 40 years, including serving as White House correspondent for NBC News from 1977 to 1982. She served as anchor and senior correspondent for Inside Politics on CNN for 12 years. Previously, for 7 years, she anchored a monthly program for Bloomberg Television, Conversations with Judy Woodruff. She's received more than 25 honorary degrees and served in key roles for a number of civic and charitable initiatives.
Hello, everyone. I'm Judy Woodruff of the PBS NewsHour, and I want to thank the Committee of 70 for inviting me to participate in this year's event. I have a family connection to Philadelphia as my husband grew up there, so I'm especially honored to join you. I also want to congratulate you on the work you have done over the years to strengthen our democracy, and especially to congratulate your president, David Thornburgh, for his leadership as he prepares to step down. As I do so, I also want to say hello to his remarkable mother, Ginny, whom I've known for many years as an extraordinary advocate for those with disabilities. As a mother of a son with disabilities myself, I am so grateful for the work that Ginny and her late husband and David's father, former Attorney General Dick Thornburgh, did to further this cause. I've covered American politics for 50 years and Washington for more than 40 of those, but it's safe to say I have never seen it as divided as it is today. When my husband and I were first married, both of us news reporters, we sought out Democrats and Republicans to try to understand the issues of the day and what political forces were at work. I remember inviting members of Congress over for dinner from both parties and hearing spirited debates about major legislation, from taxes to foreign policy. I listened and I asked questions as these elected representatives from across the country spoke energetically, sometimes with great passion, about why they believed what they did and why they thought the other argument was wrong. But it was always with respect for the other side, with a sense that the other party might be wrong on this, but they deserve to be heard, that this is the way democracy works. Today is different. Far fewer members of Congress moved to Washington, much less moved their families here. They spend a lot of time traveling back and forth to their districts or states. They have to raise more money than ever before to run for re-election, a full-time job in itself. And they spend much more time with members of their own party, in caucus meetings and other party-only gatherings. Many hardly know anyone in the other party, much less become good friends with them. People who belong to the other party are too often viewed as not just wrong, but evil or unpatriotic. Disagreements over the right way forward on government spending become a shouting match over who's a loyal American and who isn't. I used to believe that this was a mainly Washington phenomenon, that the American people, most of them, wanted their members of Congress to work together to try to solve problems for the whole country. But now, helped along by the influence of the news media, highlighting opinion rather than reporting, and with that opinion spreading like wildfire, being welcomed by people already holding those views. And with so many members of Congress running in safely redrawn congressional districts, appealing all but exclusively to their own political base, I now see many Americans demanding their elected representative toe the line. Don't dare compromise, or I will vote you out, or even clinging to falsehoods to make their case. You asked me to project where the parties and the country go from here. It's clear to me that both parties are split in their own way, progressives and moderates among the Democrats, and pro and anti-Trump factions among Republicans. They have a lot of sorting out to do. And healthy debate is good for our democracy, both within and between the two parties. But I believe perhaps the only way they're going to return to a more civil way of working with each other is if American voters demand it. Right now, the most active and motivated voters seem to expect this kind of partisan warfare. If we want anything different, the American people themselves are going to have to call for it. And if there's a role for the news media to play in this process, I'm eager to understand what that is. In the meantime, we in the press need to keep doing our best to report accurately and fairly on what's going on, and not contributing to the partisan warfare by promoting it or exaggerating it or giving it more attention than it deserves. We need to stick to reporting, explaining, and analyzing when we know enough to do that. Bottom line, we need to focus on shedding light and not heat. Thank you for giving me a chance to say a few words. I wish you the best with the rest of your program.
Kristen Soltis Anderson is a sought-after pollster, speaker, commentator, and author. She's the author of The Selfie Vote, Where Millennials Are Leading America and How Republicans Can Keep Up. Kristen is the co-founder of Echelon Insight, an opinion research and analytics firm that serves brands, trade associations, nonprofits, and political clients. She's a Fox News contributor and has appeared on Morning Joe, The Lead with Jake Tapper, and Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO. She also hosts a weekly podcast on SiriusXM, The Trend Line with Kristen Soltis Anderson, and co-hosts a bi-weekly podcast called The Pollsters. Let's get some of Kristen's thoughts on the current state of the Republican Party.
The current makeup of the Republican Party is that the GOP has really done well in recent elections with voters who are older, voters who are in rural areas, voters who are particularly religious, and white working class voters. That's a big change to the party's makeup that's been happening in kind of slow motion over the last number of years, but that the rise of Donald Trump really accelerated. White working class kind of union voters used to be a big piece of the Democrats' coalition, particularly in the Midwest. But there's a reason why a state like Ohio, that was a quintessential swing state when I first started out working in politics, has now become a pretty solidly red state, where if you look at things like the primary for the Senate there, it's a fight to see who can be the most like Donald Trump in that primary. So the Republican Party's coalition has grown to be really rooted in a number of communities that, unfortunately for the GOP, are sort of shrinking as a proportion of the population. The census data that came out this year showed that rural areas are beginning to shrink as more and more people move to the suburbs. Now, that could be bad news for Republicans, because typically they had won the suburbs but have lost it in recent years. On the other hand, if these voters are moving back to the suburbs, and we know that the upcoming midterms are going to have a lot of congressional districts that rely on winning those suburbs, do those voters still hang on to some sort of fiscally conservative, maybe a little bit culturally conservative views and make those suburbs still up for grabs is an open question. But the party is certainly sort of skewed a little more working class, rather than that stereotype of the GOP being the party of the rich that you had maybe 15 or 20 years ago. Republicans these days are particularly concerned about issues like immigration, concerned about a feeling that there is cancel culture out there, that the media is biased against them. And some of these things are not new. Republicans have been anxious about the issue of immigration for a long time. Republicans have never gone wrong in a primary, sort of going after the media. A lot of this isn't necessarily new. What I do think is new at the moment is that for Republicans, there's a real sense of feeling under siege, feeling like the survival of the country as we know it is at stake. And you don't just see this on the Republican side. Democrats do feel this way as well. In the lead up to the 2020 election, from both parties, enormous majorities of Republicans said they thought that if Joe Biden won the election, that it would do lasting damage to the country and vice versa. But when I ask Republicans, what are they most concerned about? Issues like illegal immigration, things like worrying about defunding the police, lack of support for the police, liberal media bias, as well as high taxes, which is a bit more of a sort of conventional Republican economic concern, rise to the very top of that list. When we also ask Republican voters what priorities they're looking for in a candidate for office, we did a survey where we asked people to sort of rank a number of different qualities to say, this is absolutely necessary for me to vote for someone, or I could never vote for someone who had this quality. Or in the middle, you could just say it doesn't really matter. Interestingly, someone who has a personality like Donald Trump was pretty far down that list. It's not a top concern, but someone who fights the Democrats, who takes that sort of Donald Trump combative approach, is the sort of number one thing that Republican voters say they're looking for. It's a mix of that combative approach with an agenda that is centered around the same kind of issues that Donald Trump considered his America First agenda, things like trade, immigration, et cetera. So it's a mix of a kind of more Trumpian policy direction with, if not Trump's personality, that sort of desire to be involved in political combat nonstop. That's really what sort of Republican voters are looking for when they're trying to decide who they want to have as leaders within their own party. Republicans are in an interesting place right now because the party has evolved quite a bit from the type of party that it was when George W. Bush was president. A recent survey I did, we actually asked people if they could be a part of any one of 5 different parties. So getting rid of the 2-party system for a moment and giving people 5 options, 2 of which were right of center. One was more a traditional right of center, free market, sort of mild socially conservative, pro, family values, strong national defense type party. And then we had one that was a little more the sort of populist, taking power back from the elites, being sort of strong on border security and tough on immigration, a little bit more of kind of a Trumpian agenda on things like trade or immigration. And we found the Republican Party somewhat split on that issue, with a slight lean toward that more sort of populist, further to the right kind of party. And that's a big evolution from where things stood during the Bush era. Now, what's interesting is, in some ways, younger Republicans are trying to lead the party on a different path on issues like race, climate change, and LGBT issues. Younger Republicans, much more likely than older Republicans, to say that they know someone who uses gender neutral pronouns. They're much more likely than older Republicans to say that they believe, not in these exact words, but basically that systemic racism is real and is a challenge that we're facing in this country. And they're much more likely to prioritize an issue like climate change. So the question is, with younger Republicans being a somewhat small piece of the party, but nevertheless having views on these issues that could move the party, how fast will that evolution take place? But the counter argument to this idea that younger voters will dramatically change the GOP is that when you take that five-party question again and you ask younger voters, which one would you prefer? Most young people in general lean more to sort of left of center parties, but of those who choose a right of center party, by a sizable margin, they prefer that more populist approach than actually that conservative, that sort of traditional center-right type vision. You're not just seeing this in the US, you're seeing this in parties across Europe over the last couple of years. Center-right parties really trying to figure out what their identity is and find ways to attract younger voters who are otherwise being pulled to parties like the Green Party, or perhaps a more libertarian type party, or, as is the case, at least in this study we did in the US, to a party that's a bit more sort of tough on immigration, populist in approach, versus something that looks like center-right conservatism. So it'll be interesting to see if younger Republicans can sort of pressure their elders into taking different positions on things like race and climate change, while at the same time still being a group that tends to embrace that more populist vision for the future of the party. The other growing demographic group that Republicans have really tried to make inroads with in the last couple of years, to a lot of people's surprise, is sort of working class voters of color. And whether that's because these are folks that disliked some of the COVID lockdown policies, whether they're worried about the economy, or that they just liked something about Donald Trump's style, we've been finding in a lot of research that there has been this slight shift among voters from communities of color who are working class, being slightly more interested in a GOP message. And that could also be linked to things like views on public safety, views on immigration, which I know is counterintuitive, but it's unmistakable if you look at a map from the 2020 election and you look at which types of precincts swung the heaviest toward the GOP. It's oftentimes precincts with a high proportion of Latino voters in working class communities, looking at the Rio Grande Valley, along the border in Texas. We're seeing now, as legislators in Texas try to figure out what the congressional districts will look like for future cycles, Republicans now feeling much better about their prospects of being able to pick up voters in that Rio Grande Valley than perhaps they would have been a couple of years ago. In my home state of Florida, it wasn't just Miami-Dade County and the large Cuban population swinging to the right, but also counties like Osceola County, right outside of Disney World, where I grew up. Very sort of working class, particularly Latino majority county, didn't outright vote for Trump by a huge margin, but certainly moved further to the right relative to where they were 4 years ago. So the good news for Republicans is that even as America becomes more and more diverse, a lot of this talk that sort of demographics are destiny, and therefore this will mean Republicans are out of luck moving forward, there's a caveat to that, which is that for Republicans, having this kind of more working class appeal, it doesn't seem just confined to white working class voters. It does seem like it's had some spillover effects. So as America does grow more and more diverse as a country, that does not mean that Republicans are guaranteed to lose over the long term, particularly since it seems like they've got the beginnings of ingredients to begin assembling a more diverse working class coalition.
You know, this voting booth is a little less stable than we'd like it to be. It wobbles and it shakes. And we got to make sure that we do everything we can to shore up the voting booth and the process that lies behind it. As mandated in the Constitution, every state and every municipality every 10 years has to draw new election maps to take into account shifts in population. Too often that process has been abused. Partisan operators take the map drawing process to make sure that their candidates win and that the other folks lose. And those maps that produce those results are locked in for 10 years. That's happened in Pennsylvania before. Both parties have been guilty of it. In 2011, the process was positively goofy. We ended up with congressional maps that looked like this, which some folks have suggested looks like Donald Duck kicking Goofy. No way for elected representatives to represent their voters. That's why we launched Draw the Lines PA. Draw the Lines PA is an experiment in massive public engagement in the map drawing process. Through biannual competitions, we've enlisted 7,211 Pennsylvania citizens and given them the chance to draw their own congressional maps. In the process, helping them understand why the maps are important and how every twist and turn of that map can make a difference in the elections that take place. Draw the Lines is coming into the spotlight now because from those 7,211 submissions, we've drawn a composite citizens congressional map and are using that as the official process unfolds to make sure that the voice of the citizens is heard. That map, representing the work of citizens from 40 of the state's counties, representing 90% of the state's population, should serve as a great benchmark to make sure that we end up with a fair and responsive and representative map. Another issue that we've put front and center on the Committee of 70 screen is the issue of allowing independent voters to vote in primary elections in Pennsylvania. In 2020, 95% of the state House races were decided in the primary, meaning that independent voters, the million independent voters in the Commonwealth, who couldn't vote in those elections, had no voice in who their representative ultimately was. We think that's wrong. Pennsylvania is one of only 9 states that bars independents from voting. We think it's also damaging to the governing process because primary elections bring out the most extreme voters from the right and the left, and therefore when the dust settles after the election, their elected representative has very little incentive to move towards the middle, to compromise and get things done. So we'll continue to work on that issue to bring the voting process to 1 million Pennsylvanians who have been excluded over the years. You won't miss the Volkswagen, and it says... Some of you may remember from last year's event, we did a little bit with the Philly Fanatic, promising a Volkswagen tour of the Commonwealth to spread the word about good voting habits and to push back against partisan gerrymandering. Well, you know what? We pulled it off. Earlier this year, the Great Volkswagen Tour of Pennsylvania set out and visited 47 communities around the Commonwealth, racking up 2,267 miles on the old Volkswagen.
Wow, I've never been to the Committee of 70 offices. It could really double as a political campaign memorabilia museum. Thank you, David. These are some great initiatives as well. Now, let's continue with Kristen and her thoughts on the future of the Republican Party.
So we have a lot of voters that are these interesting swing voters that have emerged, and you find them particularly in places like the Midwest. Take a state like Iowa, for instance, a state that actually voted for Barack Obama, but then flipped and is relatively solidly Trump country these days, or at least it's pretty safe for Republicans. Or a state like Indiana, where actually Barack Obama won Indiana, at least in 2008, and yet Indiana is now not really considered a state that, at least at a statewide level, Democrats have a strong shot at winning. And a lot of the reason why is because you had these sort of white working class voters who began to view the Democratic Party as no longer really being in their interest. That whichever party can kind of corner the market of saying, we understand the middle and working class, will do quite well in many of these places. It's a good message for any party to have, but in particular, Donald Trump in 2016 was able to make the case to a number of voters who had voted for Obama in the past that he was going to be the one that would be best looking out for their economic interest And he would be the one that would be most focused on sort of fighting the elites. Again, it's a little bit less about a left-right perspective and more about a sort of power to the people versus power to the elites kind of argument. And that's why Donald Trump was able to peel away a number of these white working class voters for whom someone like Mitt Romney just wasn't really their flavor of Republican, but Donald Trump represented something different. And that's why they decided to go ahead and vote for him. However, you also had a lot of folks that maybe were Republicans, swing voters that gave Donald Trump a shot, in part because they wanted to send a message to those elites. But by the time you got to 2020 and we had seen the sort of chaos that the last 4 years had, whether it was the response to the pandemic, whether it was, sort of the general constant craziness of the news cycle, there were a lot of voters that maybe had said they wanted to give Donald Trump a chance, but by the time you got to 2020, just sort of felt exhausted by it. And in a way, Joe Biden's message of, I'm going to be a competent adult that you won't have to think of that much, was actually appealing to quite a number of voters. In the 2020 election, it was pretty interesting. You have a lot of people that are Donald Trump only voters at this point. They're not very closely connected to the political process. They think both parties get things pretty wrong. But when Donald Trump's name is on a ballot, they're willing to turn out. And that was good for Republicans in 2016. It was not so good for them in 2018 when Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot and Democrats swept and took control of the House of Representatives. In 2020, you saw sky-high voter turnout, and it wasn't just sky-high voter turnout for Joe Biden. A lot of people did turn out for Donald Trump, and you did, again, see some of those swings toward Trump in places you might not have expected. But ultimately, Biden was able to sort of shore up these voters in the suburbs around major metropolitan areas who were just looking for a little more stability, a little less chaos, a little less constantly having to think about what was going on in Washington. If you take a look at maps of somewhere like Atlanta, for instance, a really crucial state in this last election, because 20 years ago, the idea of Georgia becoming a blue state would have been a little bit crazy. And yet here we are, Georgia voting very narrowly for Biden and then sending 2 Democrats to the US Senate. Pretty surprising outcome if you look at it over a long enough term. And a lot of that was built off of these suburbs. There's a map that the New York Times Upshot folks put together. They looked at each precinct around Atlanta and whether those precincts had swung to the right or to the left relative to where they had voted in the 2016 election. And if you look at Atlanta, actually the center of Atlanta hasn't moved that much. That urban voters were already pretty Democratic as a coalition. They didn't move that much. But it was those suburbs around Atlanta that created this kind of blue donut around the city core. And that was a sign of those dense, sort of middle to upper middle class suburbs saying that they wanted stability, they wanted calm, they were off the Trump train, and they voted for Biden in the process. Now, the real challenge for Democrats is, can you hold on to those voters? If you have an economy that's not doing so great, if we're still dealing with COVID a year from now, that's the one issue where Joe Biden gets pretty strong marks. If we're still dealing with COVID, then perhaps some of the issues that those suburban voters had left the GOP over, they won't find very satisfying answers on the Democratic side either, and they'll be back up for grabs. If Donald Trump runs for president again, I suspect he'll find a reasonably easy time winning in a Republican primary, because even though he lost the election, and typically if you lose an election, your party sort of puts you into the wilderness for a little bit, because so many Republicans believe that the election was not fairly fought, believe Donald Trump should be the rightful president, there hasn't been a lot of introspection. You won't see any kind of autopsy coming out of the Republican Party this time. They believe that the party is still in a strong position and on the right path. And for a majority of Republicans, if Donald Trump were to run again, they say they would be open to voting for him. So in a primary, it's hard to imagine another Republican successfully defeating Donald Trump if he truly runs and decides he wants to do this again. But the general election is a very different matter. In the general election, you have a lot of voters who were very frustrated with Donald Trump. They broke away from him. And even if they had voted for Donald Trump, felt very disillusioned and dismayed by all of the chaos that unfolded after the election, whether it was the questioning of the election results, culminating in the events of January 6th, that Donald Trump has perhaps not done himself very many favors with swing voters in the time since he lost the election in 2020. But at the same time, there's a big question about what Democrats will do. Both Donald Trump and Joe Biden would be quite old when you get around to 2024. And if Joe Biden doesn't run, would it be Kamala Harris? Her favorable, unfavorable rating in a lot of polling I've looked at doesn't look great. So you may have another election where you have two big candidates that voters in the middle aren't really crazy about and are left with a choice between, well, I don't really like either of these people. What do I do now? So Donald Trump would be very formidable in a Republican primary in 2024, but I have serious doubts about his ability to win the White House again, given sort of the continued unpopularity he's experiencing, even among some of those voters who did vote for him in 2020. One of the big ironies of the political moment that we're in is at the same time that a lot of voters say that they don't really love either party, that they don't feel closely affiliated to either one, that we also have some of the greatest polarization that we've ever seen, with Americans increasingly likely to segment themselves into camps. They may not like their own party very much, but they really don't like the other side. And that growing polarization isn't just about fights over what kind of policies are happening in Washington. It's bleeding into the kinds of products people want to buy, how they feel about major brands. It's showing up in people's fights over what kids should be taught in schools, et cetera. This polarization has gotten really deep, and I think it has been inflamed by the COVID-19 crisis. So if you have a lot of voters that are very disaffected from at least from the other party, as well as the one that they ostensibly affiliate with, well, wouldn't there be room for another option? If everybody's so upset, why don't you create something new? And the reality is that structurally in the US, there are many reasons why a third party hasn't really emerged. It is possible for a new party to emerge, but usually that would be displacing one of the two existing parties because of our single member district, first past the post system, a number of things sort of enshrined into the way we govern based on the Constitution, just make it very hard for a third party to emerge. It's just the structure of our government is so different from many of these countries that have parliaments where you can have any number of parties participating in government. But I also always caution folks who are political elites and who imagine that if only we had a sort of centrist third party, that would solve the problem. Typically, those folks have views that are a little more socially progressive, while at the same time being relatively fiscally conservative. You can think, for instance, of someone like Mike Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City, who tried to take this sort of more independent kind of tack. You've seen a number of business leaders, whether it's Howard Schultz, former CEO of Starbucks, kind of taking that approach as well. You find that it doesn't actually have that much of an audience. And that's because the political center in America of those who are disaffected from the parties are much less likely to be that sort of socially progressive, fiscally conservative type of voter, and are more likely to be the opposite. They're more likely to be culturally conservative, but be okay with a more robust social safety net, of wanting the government to be more actively involved in the economy. These are, frankly, the very types of voters that Donald Trump added to the Republican coalition that had been pretty poorly served by both political parties for quite some time. So I think the question is it possible for, say, the Republican or the Democratic Party to co-opt that group of voters who feel underserved, bring them into their tent without alienating anyone else who's already there? That seems to be more likely than the prospect of creating some sort of centrist third party. Now, I did that survey where I asked Americans, looking at the 5 different political parties that we might have if we were a country like, say, Germany, any number of these European democracies where they have sort of a far-right party, a more traditional center-right party, a center-left party, a kind of classical liberal or libertarian party, and then finally a green party or a socialist party. We find that in the US, most people would sort of prefer kind of a labor party. That one gets the plurality. They're not ready to go all the way to a green party type model. In fact, it's really only young Democrats who lean more towards saying that that's actually the vision that they would want. And it is younger voters who are among the most interested in that sort of centrist libertarian type party. But even there, it's not necessarily the plurality response that you might expect. So I think when you ask people to choose among the 5 different parties, it's just a reminder that for some people, the current parties don't feel like they serve them well, but it's not because their views are in some sort of happy middle ground, but rather those parties are not viewed as being sort of committed or extreme enough. They're not bold enough, perhaps, is the nicer way to frame it. And so some of those voters do wind up further on the outsides.
We're going to take a quick break, and then I'm back with Representative James Clyburn, the House Majority Whip. But first, a message from our great friend Jerry Sweeney and Brandywine Realty Trust.
Hi, I'm Jerry Sweeney of Brandywine Realty Trust, and I'm really pleased to join you this evening. 2021 has been a year of transition with some real highs, but also some lows. But we're clearly on our way back, though there's much work that's still to be done. We have a public health crisis that still pervades our lives. Our principles of democracy continue to be challenged, and we've been confronted with deepening political, economic, equity, and environmental issues. But we, as a city, continue to face these challenges head on, handling adversity with both resiliency and grit. The city of Philadelphia has learned it is important, now more than ever, to uplift one another. We have also been reminded of the value of our incredible civic and community organizations. Organizations like the Committee of 70 work to ensure an effective public discourse on the challenges we face right here in Philadelphia. Their mission has been proven to be more important than ever this past year. They advocate for good governance, transparent public policy, and a disciplined allocation and accountability of all public resources. Brandywine is proud to be a sponsor and supporter of the Committee of 70 and its very important mission. At Brandywine, we are guided by the belief that our properties can positively impact people's lives and enrich the local community. We believe in creating opportunity for all Philadelphians, and through our work we are volunteering our time, creating paths to family-sustaining jobs, and investing in community programs to ensure both economic and social equity. Community leaders like the Committee of 70 are changing the social, economic, and physical landscape to create a better Philadelphia for tomorrow, and frankly, a better Philadelphia for future generations. We applaud your great work and are honored to be a partner. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.
Majority Whip James Clyburn has served in the United States Congress for the past 28 years, representing South Carolina's 6th Congressional District. He's the third-ranking Democrat and one of the most influential leaders in the Democratic Party. He previously served as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and is a sought-after endorsement of Democrats seeking to become President of the United States. He's been focused on legislation and policies that support economic development and has been the architect of many initiatives that have become law, including key funding formulas in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Please welcome our friend, James Clyburn. Congressman, nice to see you.
Thank you very much for having me.
So the hottest book in the country right now is Peril, written by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa. You're laughing already. That's a good thing. You know that General Milley gets a lot of attention in the book, but so do you. And there's a story told in the book that I want to confirm. It's the Biden inauguration and two American presidents, President Clinton and President Bush, George W. Bush, both single you out and tell you, same word, you are the savior, that but for you, it would have been Donald Trump reelected. First of all, is the story true?
There's some truth to that. I'm not too sure which word is best, savior or saver. George W. and I are both golfers, and you know, saver is the word that we prefer, saving par, and of course, saving strokes. Savior takes on another meaning, and so I would much rather be saver.
When you look back at the last presidential cycle and you think about the role that you played, do you sometimes wonder what would have happened if you had not come forward when you did and endorsed then Vice President Biden?
Yes, I do, and I give credit for that to my late wife. You know about my so-called world famous fish fry. At the fish fry in 2019, we had over 20 candidates for president attending the fish fry. It turned out to be the biggest we'd ever had. So big, the fire department and police department sort of closed the gates, wouldn't let anybody else in. And so that night after the fish fry, and I got home, my wife, who was ailing with diabetes at the time, could not come to the fish fry. So I sat at her bedside as she was getting her nightly peritoneal treatment. And I started sharing with her what had happened at the fish fry. And I said to her, I said, we're going to have a tough time this year. We got over 20 candidates running for president. Some of them are very close friends of ours. It's going to be tough trying to make a decision. And she said to me, I don't care how tough it's going to be. I don't care how many friends we got in the race. If we really want to win, we'd better nominate Joe Biden. And she so she had said all of that. So this was like May or June. She passed away September 19th, which was about 4 months before the South Carolina primary. So all of that was weighing heavily on me when it was getting down to decision time. And about 3 days before the debate down in Charleston, I went to a funeral and ran into a lady that I had never met before. And when she asked me who I was going to vote for in the primary, and I told her, if you had seen the look on your face, you would understand why I became so emotional in that endorsement. So here, these two African-American women, both of whom saying to me that we needed Joe Biden. And so, though I was going to vote for Joe, the emotions in the endorsement came from those two experiences.
Okay, which is a perfect setup for me to then ask you, of all people, how's he doing? He's got a full plate.
He is doing very well. He has some challenges no president has ever had. We have never seen a country so divided. Now, history has. This country was divided over the Civil War. We had a lot of divisions back in the 60s that I was a part of. But for a country to be so divided with the truth being so far from any presence in any of it, how can you lead a country when people don't believe in science, or at least pretend not to, when people don't accept the inner workings of a democracy? So President Biden has some challenges no president has had since maybe George Washington and Abraham Lincoln.
Congressman, I know you see the polling data, the same data that I see. You probably see much more detailed information. He's underwater with independents right now. Having won them by 13 points, he's at minus 13, and I would argue he's in desperate need of a win. Why not give him the win on the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package?
We're going to do that, but we have to understand that it's one thing to salvage our roads and our bridges. It's one thing to deepen our ports and fix our rails. All of that needs to be done. But we have got to do something about the human spirit. Too many people are losing confidence in the government to do what needs to be done. Too many people are losing confidence in whether this country's democracy can in fact survive. We've got a wealth gap that's widening in this country along racial lines. We got a health gap that's widening among rural versus urban. These kinds of challenges these are infrastructure issues, and Neil's saying that the human infrastructure is just as important as the physical infrastructure that we are working with. So you have to balance these things. And I'll give you an example, even within our party, and I've been trying to get people to understand that I'm all for health care. But when you start talking about we don't have enough money for poor people because we got to spend money on rich people getting dental and vision care, and that's what you're doing when you expand Medicare, because everybody, we don't means test Medicare. Millionaires get Medicare. And so low-income people can't get Medicaid, and that's the kind of stuff that we are working with. And so we're going to give him a double win. And I think that 13 will flip again.
Are Senators Manchin and Sinema the problem or the solution?
Well, I think that they could be a solution. I think that it's good for people to question things, to challenge things. Look, challenging the status quo is something that needs to be done all the time. But let's not lose sight on what the goal is. The goal is not to carry out a challenge. The goal is to find a solution to problems. And if that process that you're going through will prevent us from getting to a solution, then we've got to do something about the process. That's why we don't let any one person stop the budget. That's why we have reconciliations when it comes to doing budget stuff, because we aren't going to let one person initiate a filibuster and threaten the ability of the country to do its business. That's why you hear a lot of talk today that maybe we ought to get rid of the filibuster in order to do something about the debt, even among those people who don't want to get rid of the filibuster, to do something about constitutional rights. Because the full faith and credit of the United States ought not be filibustered by any one person. And I think that that's the challenge that we have today.
You know that history suggests that your party, the Democratic Party, will lose 26 seats in the midterm election. That's typically what happens for a president's party during the midterm election. Respond to those who say if Democrats, I hear this from some of my radio callers, if Democrats spend, quote unquote, all that money, they are guaranteeing Republican control of the House of Representatives, and you can say hello to Speaker Kevin McCarthy.
Well, I would say to them that if your emphasis is on how much money you spend, rather than how much good you do, or how many problems you solve, or what good you do to move this country to a better place, if that is going to be your criteria, you're probably right, and we aren't long for democracy. What we've got to do is address the problems that exist in this society. Too many people are being undereducated or not educated at all. Too many people are sick without health care that they need. Too many things need to be done in our communities in order for people to have clean drinking water, for people to have the health care that they need. So these things are important. And that's why I've been saying to everybody, let's stop talking about what the number is. And let's start talking about what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make sure that when young children go to school, they have enough health care in order to do well in school. We're trying to make sure that when high school children graduate, we got enough post-secondary education for them in order to prepare themselves for lives. For livelihoods. So that's where we are. But every time I get up in the mornings, I hear 1.5, 3.5. I don't hear anybody talking about healthcare, education, fixing the problems that exist in our society. And I guarantee you, when you fix these problems, nobody's going to ask you how much did it cost.
Quick final question, and then I'll conclude this part of our dialogue. I hope you'll give me an answer. You are the House Majority Whip. To me, that's like herding cats. Which is harder for you to corral, the problem solvers or the progressives?
They both have their challenges because, as you can see, I'm Black. I don't, because I'm Black, I'm a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. I've been in Congress almost 30 years. I've never joined any of the others. I'm not a progressive by membership. or a problem solver or a blue dog. I'm a Democrat. And I do participate in the Congressional Black Caucus because for some strange reason, I can't deny that existence. So they all have their challenges.
We'll be back in a moment with Congressman Clyburn.
We are fueled by a passion for quality, integrity, innovation, and community. A commitment to thinking big, diving deep, and delivering results. We are partners, neighbors, trailblazers. Owning, leasing, developing, and managing hundreds of properties and millions of square feet nationwide. We are always looking toward the future. We know the value in what we do lies in the difference we can make. We are Brandywine Realty Trust.
And we're back with Congressman James Clyburn. Congressman, this Facebook whistleblower has gotten a tremendous amount of attention this week. Is it time to rethink Section 230? Is it time to rethink the immunity that social media platforms have been provided?
Absolutely. You know, this whole notion that we ought not have regulations, that is just crazy stuff. You are regulated in your business. I'm regulated in mine. There are rules that we have to live by based upon what's the best for society. And we made a tremendous mistake, I believe, very strongly. Now, you and I probably won't agree on this because my own daughter, who served about 9 years on the Federal Communications Commission, disagreed with me on this, and that's fine. But I think we made a big mistake when we got rid of the fairness doctrine. I really believe that what we have allowed people to do is weaponize the airwaves in such a way that it's driving people apart. And to have any entity as influential as we know social media to be without any kind of constraints, that's a real big problem. We govern people's conduct with speech in person. So why don't we govern their conduct over the airwaves? That's a problem that we have created for ourselves. And I think we made a big mistake with the Federal Communications Commission, and we're making the same big mistake with social media.
Well, I actually think that bombastic personalities have driven us into this polarization ditch. You're right. I do question whether the fairness doctrine is the way to solve it. But the reason I'm so closely paying attention to Facebook is that this is much more subtle. You've got people going into Facebook's news feed each and every day and being fed information, not recognizing that Facebook's got your number. They want to stir the pot. They want to pit us against one another. And they want you to keep coming back for more information. When you turn on Fox News, when you turn on a cable outlet, I think you know what you're getting. I'm afraid that people don't recognize what they're being fed by Facebook.
I think you're right about that. It's a much more complicated issue than I just made it. And I think you put your finger right on it. The subtleties are there. You wake up and don't know exactly why you're feeling the way you're feeling. And that is what is so bad about what is going on with Facebook. And to see this Instagram or whatever it is that seems to be running especially young women. This stuff has got to stop. When people don't know what's happening to them, we ought to govern the people who got some ways to create that phenomenon.
Congressman Robert Kagan recently published an essay in the Washington Post. I'll bet you saw it. The headline was, "Our constitutional crisis is already here." Even if you didn't read the essay, are we now in the midst of a constitutional crisis?
I did glance through that essay, and I labored for a while on the headline because I have been saying for some time now You may not remember back in 2018, the night before his State of the Union address, I said to Don Lemon that 45 was not intending to give up the office. I said it then. I was chastised severely by a lot of people for having said it, because I compared him that night to Mussolini. And now I'm seeing that a lot of people are comparing him to Mussolini. In fact, the night he came home from came back to the White House from the hospital with COVID-19 and went on the Truman balcony, he was referred to the next morning by one talking head as assuming a Mussolini stance. So yes, we are already in a constitutional crisis. We just have not broken ourselves yet. But if we don't do things like get Facebook under control and all other social media, if we won't do things like get this country's debts paid, stop using all kinds of processes to muddle up the works of the country, that is a big, big problem. Now, I tell people all the time, if I didn't know history as well as I do, and I don't know 1/10 of what I should know, I might not be concerned about this. But I've studied what happened in Germany after a free election. Hitler was absolutely popular, elected as chancellor, and set out to discredit the institutions of a great country and became a dictator. This man was elected president and set out to bring discredit on the institutions, referring to the media, or the press, if you please, as the enemy of the people. That's bad stuff. And that stuff is ruining us. January 6th was a trial run. We had better do something about it and do it quickly.
So one of my observations is to say that it's not all tied to one personality, right? I mean, 74, 75
Absolutely
million.
not.
So even if he's not a candidate in 2024, the forces that would vote for him are still among us. What is it we need to say to all of them?
It's not just what we say, it is what we do. That's why I think we have to start solving problems rather than creating them. That's why I say, people I talk to now, they seem to think that you really make it in this country when you can create a good headline. How many hits you get for some smart aleck comment you made, rather than creating ways that we make headway for the American people. We've got to solve the problems. We should not have health care not sufficient in rural communities. We ought not have education insufficient in communities of color. We've got to make the greatness of the society accessible and affordable by all of its citizens. That's the pledge I made to the people that I represent way back yonder, and I try to keep that pledge. That's why I came up with that 10, 20, 30 formula, so that we can target resources where they are needed, rather than keep giving things to people because they've got merit. You know, it's like Jim Folsom, big Jim Folsom, not the young Jim Folsom, who said one time, I believe in merit. The Alabama merit system, my friends got more merit than my enemies. That's what we're doing here.
There was a book that was written after the 2016 cycle by Ben Bradley Jr., the son of, and it was called The Forgotten, and it was about Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. I'm a Pennsylvanian lifelong, and it's about one county in the northeastern part of the state where arguably it tipped the balance of power for Donald Trump. My point is this: there are a lot of white working class folks who think they're now getting the short end, that in a world of changing demographics and jobs being outsourced and the world, as Tom Friedman says, gone flat, that they come out on the short end of the stick. We need to reach them. And as you say, do things for them. Those are, that's my input, my 2 cents.
I agree with that. But it's not just white. The same thing goes with black. The best example I could give you, if you look at what happened coming out of the Great Depression, everybody says that Franklin Roosevelt did this great job bringing us out of the Great Depression. Social Security got so many seniors out of poverty. Well, the fact of the matter is, when Social Security went in place, it did not cover domestic workers. Who were the domestic workers? They were Black folks in the South. It did not cover farm workers. Who were the farm workers? The people who had just come off the farms, the plantations here in the South. We created these pockets of poverty throughout the South. And what we are doing now is about to do the same thing with this recovery package. That's why I've been trying to get my folks to understand. There's a big difference in Medicaid and Medicare, because Medicare is for everybody, wealthy alike. Medicaid, low-income people. So we cannot do the same today with this problem that we did back in the 1930s. That's why every time somebody tells me that Joe Biden is going to be another FDR, I say, I hope not.
Congressman, what do you most want to know about January 6th?
The most I want to know is who paid for it. Follow the money. Find it and follow it. I don't care about who came here. It can be the Boogaloo Boys or whoever they are. Somebody financed it. And that's how you solve the problem. Find out who paid for it.
And you think financed with the intent of stopping the Congress from certifying the vote and enabling the House of Representatives to then call the shot?
Absolutely. Everything on January 6th was about getting rid of a fair, unfettered election. Probably, I know the fair's in my lifetime. I've never seen an election with so much participation, so many guardrails, and yielding a result that is being challenged by those who would much rather an autocracy than a democracy.
You know that many states, under the guise of strengthening ballot security, have changed their voter laws. Is there a realistic process of there being some type of Voting Rights Act implemented by the Congress before the midterm election?
If we don't, we can kiss democracy goodbye. Because remember, this is not just about whether or not Black folks vote. Look at what they did in Georgia and what they're attempting to do in Texas. It's about nullifying the results of an election if you don't like the outcome. And that is what is at stake here. Whether or not we allow Martin Luther King Jr.'s great speech, everybody talk about I have a dream. It wasn't about a dream. It was about interposition and nullification. That's the way he concluded that speech. I'm going back to the South, where these governors have interposition and nullification dripping from their lips. That's what he was talking about. It is here. We are attempting for the first time in my 80 plus years to see nullification on steroids.
Final question. What's the good news? I feel like we've bummed everybody out.
Well, the good news is that January 6th came and went without success. It'll be better news if we find the source and do what is necessary for it to never happen again. But you cannot do that with partisanship. We've got to come together in a bipartisan way and root out these causes and make sure that we put guardrails in place that will not allow it to happen again.
Congressman, thank you so much. Next time, don't hold back. Next time, tell us what you really think, okay?
Do that.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you very much for having me.
You know, today's title is Principles, Parties, and Where America Goes From Here. Let me offer a thought on the last part, where we go from here. Think about this: Afghanistan withdrawal, debate about infrastructure, debt ceiling, Trump tell-alls, the death of Gabby Petito, Captain Kirk really going to space. There's no shortage of news. But I argue that in this climate, the most important story is actually none of the above. Instead, it's Facebook. Frances Haugen is the Facebook whistleblower we've all seen by now since she first appeared on 60 Minutes last Sunday night. She has analogized the impact of an unregulated Facebook to big tobacco, seatbelts, and opioids. Part of what she's revealed is how Facebook knows that Instagram, which it owns, is toxic for teen girls because of the impact that it has on body image. And that's very important. But there's something else that impacts all of us and goes to the heart of our democracy. For a long time, I've tried to educate about the perils of a polarized media, how we've never had so much choice in where we get our news and information, and yet so few seem to exercise that opportunity. Instead, we hunker down in our silos of ideological media worlds that reaffirm our previously held views instead of sampling competing thought. The climate won't change, I say, until more of us change the channel. Well, for many, Facebook controls the remote. Their news feed, where users get a constantly updated, personalized source of both news and personal information, like photos, is where most of the platform's 3 billion users spend their time. Advertising here and at Instagram, it accounts for nearly all of the 86 billion Facebook generated in revenue last year. What determines what gets in each user's feed? That would be Facebook's proprietary algorithm. It considers what they know of your interests and associations and feeds you content to keep you hooked. In 2018, when the algorithm's formula was changed, supposedly to improve a user's well-being, it instead rewarded the angriest, most divisive voices. Think of that friend or relative that we all have, who takes their politics to an extreme. Their own internal memos acknowledged this, quote, "Misinformation, toxicity, and violent content are inordinately prevalent among reshares." We've talked a lot about important issues here tonight. But none of the rest of what we've discussed will matter if we don't first get the public arena under control, incentivize outlets to provide balance, and educate consumers about the limitations of being overly dependent upon one source. It's time to restore some decorum and stop ceding the town square to the loudest voices. Thank you, Committee of 70, and good luck and congratulations to David Thornburg.
You know, when it comes to elections, the Committee of 70 doesn't have a dog or a donkey in the fight. But when these guys came to town en masse in 2016, we were fully prepared to take advantage of that opportunity to fulfill our mission of educating voters. We hosted, with the University City Science Center, a terrific pitch event and trade show for technology folks from around the country who were using technology, apps, the internet, everything in between, to find new ways to engage voters. In collaboration with our terrific colleague David Bradley, we also produced a 20-minute theater production called Voices of Voting and showed that to over 2,000 high school students from around the region that gave them a sense of how important young voices were to securing the right to vote in the turmoil of the 50s and 60s. Finally, let's go pay a visit to one of my dear friends and a great citizen not only of Philadelphia, but of the world. Let's go. I want to close with a little reflection with one of my great friends, Ben Franklin. He doesn't talk much, but he's been a presence in the office at the Committee of 70 for my entire tenure. He's got a mean day-glow outfit, which in and of itself reminds me of the energy that he brought to so much of Philadelphia as an entrepreneur, but as an architect of our democracy. And Ben, I think, stood for, in a way that only he could, a lot of the things that we care about at the Committee of 70. A sense of continuous improvement, a sense of individual responsibility, a sense of entrepreneurship and innovation. So he's a good guy to have around. He also, though, in one of his well-known sayings, statements, was captured on the way out of the Constitutional Convention on September 17th, saying something quite challenging, which is when asked whether he and his colleagues had created a monarchy or a republic, his answer was, in a very challenging and sobering way, he said, "It's a republic if we can keep it." And that to me is part of the central role that the Committee of 70 plays here as a champion of local democracy in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, to do everything we can day in and day out to make sure that we keep this republic that Ben and others created. It's been a real honor and privilege to serve the Committee of 70 and the people of the Commonwealth over these last 7 years. And I want to convey my great and heartfelt thanks to our board, leadership, particularly our current chair, Mike Stiles, and also to our amazing, small but mighty staff at the Committee of 70, who over the last few years have literally left everything on the field to serve the electoral process and the people of Pennsylvania. On behalf of the Committee of 70, I also want to offer a special thanks to the participants in tonight's program, beginning with our great friend Michael Smerconish, who showed once again why he is such a gift to this city, this region, and to the nation. I'd also like to thank Kristen Soltis Anderson, Representative Jim Clyburn, and Judy Woodruff, who have helped us wrap our heads around some of the most challenging issues that we have to face as a nation, as Pennsylvanians, and that's the future of our political process and the future of our political parties. But as they say, sometimes when one door closes, another door opens. And now it's time for me to take the opportunity to walk through that open door, invoking the spirit of Ben Franklin, who I think encouraged all of us to take advantages of new opportunities and new possibilities in our lives and our careers. So thank you to all of you, and I hope you'll be with us in the Committee of 70 as I will be in spirit and in action over the years to come.